Hey guys, welcome to another video by your favorite Texan camper, Tim V here. Today I'm going to be showing you a camera that I think, in a lack of a better word, is the perfect camera for hiker, backpacker, filmmakers. And I'm going to go through a lot of different features. This is basically just going to be a preview of this camera so that I can give you guys an idea of why I chose this camera and why I think if you're a backpacker or a hiker who likes to film while you're doing your hiking videos, I think this is the perfect universal camera. So the first thing I want to explain about this is the FZ300 from Panasonic, and this camera is what we would call a bridge camera. And to give you an explanation of what a bridge camera is basically a cross or hybrid of a point and shoot and a DSLR, which is a digital single lens reflex camera. A bridge camera does not give you the capability of changing out the lenses. The benefit of that, there are pros and cons to that. Some of the pros to that is that you're not having to constantly swap out lenses. You're not having to carry a bunch of lenses with you on your backpack or hiking adventure, or if you're a filmmaker in general. So if you've done this before, you understand what I mean by that. The lens on this camera is 25 to 600 millimeters, and that gives you a very good range of close-up shots for landscapes or zoom-in capabilities for telephoto shots of animals and whatnot. Now, some of the cons of having a bridge camera like this is that if this lens were to break, or if you wanted to improve picture quality, you cannot. It's a built-in lens, so you cannot change the lens to upgrade it. So that's the only con really to this. So with that explained, that's basically what a bridge camera is. It's basically a hybrid, a cross between a point and shoot camera and a DSLR semi-pro consumer grade camera. Now, one of the features on this camera is going to be obviously a flip out screen, so you can compose a shot if you like to use it for selfie mode. For vlogging, there is the on switch just right here by the mode dial. Turn that on. This is a 3-inch screen, touch screen. You can touch the screen and make all your adjustments. It's a very bright screen. I noticed that in sunlight, when I was out the other day testing this camera out, I had no issue seeing anything as far as on the touch screen itself. It's extremely bright. I don't know the exact pixel count, but it's extremely high resolution, so if you're trying to focus in and dial in your shots and whatnot on the focus mode, you can see extremely clear with that. So the touchscreen is a real bonus for this if you don't want to have to use all of the analog manual dials. Now, the sensor on this camera is, I believe, what they refer to as a 1/2 sensor, which is, I think, the smallest sensor you can get in a consumer grade camera, compared to Panasonic's other cameras, which refer to a micro 4/3. So this sensor, being as small as it is, you have to understand that in low light situations, this camera does struggle giving you a good clean image when you start to crank up the ISO levels. So with that in mind, you need to be prepared to know that under low light circumstances, your picture quality will decrease because of the small sensor, because it's gathering less light, versus a sensor that's a 1-inch or a full frame 35 millimeter type of lens, which can gather a lot more light because the pixels and the sensor is a lot larger. Another thing I want to explain that this camera has, if you don't already know, is that this camera is 4K high resolution capable, meaning that you can get extremely high resolution using 4K processing versus 1080p. So the benefit of that is that you get extremely high resolution and great detail. I don't render in 4K, which is not a big issue. My editor doesn't allow me to render in 4K, and I would rather choose not to do that, because when you start to get into 4K rendering, it's going to eat up a lot of memory in your CPU, your computer. It also takes a long time to render the video in its final stage versus if you rendered in 1080p. I prefer to render in 1080p because the resolution difference. Now, the 4K sensor on this camera is not native 4K, and I'm going to explain why that's not a big issue. Native 4K is roughly 4096 by 2160, which is cinema 4K that you would see in the theaters. Now, consumer TVs, like the TV you may own, a Sony, whatever TV you have, The resolution for the 4K is cropped to 3860 by 2160. So because it's not native 4K is not a big issue, because the display you're going to be putting it on is going to be a standard TV or a display monitor, which isn't native 4K to begin with. All standard US TVs commercially are 3860 by 2160, so the fact that it's not native 4K is not an issue, and don't let anybody tell you that it is, because it's not. Native 4K at the 4096 is strictly for cinema 4K, which is not going to be an issue when you're watching it on your TV at home. Now, another really great feature of this 4K camera is that when you're recording 4K video, you can actually extract in the video a single 4K shot at 8 megapixels. The benefit of that is that if you're filming something like, say, a family member or an outing or a sports event or your child playing around or whatnot, you can extract a single video clip or frame that looks really good as a single shot in case you miss the perfect shot trying to get it with just the camera mode. So for example, let me go into the camera. I've got a pre-selected video here. So I just recorded a little bit of my son playing around. So if I hit play, you can see I can watch the video. He's playing around. And there's a lot of good shots that I can steal from here. So if I basically touch the screen and say pause it right there, I can go frame by frame. I'll just keep going until I find the right setting that I like where it comes into focus. So right there, that's a pretty good shot. His eyes, everything are in focus. All I have to do is simply press the menu button, and it says, do I want to save this image? I hit yes, and I just captured that image right there as a photograph right out of the video. So it's extremely perfect for that, and I love that feature. So another feature of the 4K mode on this camera is what's called 4K burst. What that means is that when you set the camera up in 4K burst mode in the settings and you hold down the shutter button, it will roughly shoot a 4K video at about 24 to 30 frames a second, I believe. And once you let go of the shutter button, it stops the recording. So all you have to do, and this is really great for action scenes when you're trying to capture that perfect moment of somebody catching a ball or kicking a soccer ball or whatever. You can actually go in there, extract that single frame image out of there at 4K and get those perfect action shots. I find that to be beneficial when you're trying to take a picture of a child and he's kind of playing around and looking at the camera. You can kind of do a 4K burst, because the benefit of doing 4K burst for picture taking versus extracting the 4K image from the video itself, and the other setting I showed you, is that you can adjust your all your manual settings for shutter speed. So that's the benefit of that. I'm not going to go into detail on how that works. There's plenty of videos on YouTube that explain 4K burst, but if you're a photographer, you'll understand the benefit of that. Now this camera does feature a hot shoe with TTL compatibility, so you can actually add an external flash if you want to upgrade and do external flash for photography work if you're going to be doing that as well. Alright, so I'm just going to point out a few other small features side here. Let's go ahead and discuss this for a second. Here you have your manual focus dial. You have autofocus, which will switch to macro photography, so you can do close-up shots of insects, flowers, butterflies, whatnot. And this is your zoom button, which you toggle up and down to get the different zoom range. Now, the only downside to the focus ring is that it's a fly-by-wire, which means that the actual focus knob is not coupled to the actual focus ring internally. It's actually done electronically, so you don't really get very precise focusing. I find that with using focus peaking on this camera, which basically highlights the subject's focused area to give you more accuracy, that is not a big issue for me. It's not a big deal. If you need something that does that, then this camera may not be for you, but I find it works extremely effective. Of course, like I said, you've got the zoom range here, and then this button here will allow you to switch between autofocus modes such as macro and landscape. A few more things that I want to highlight are the function buttons that can be programmed. I believe they're up to 5 different buttons you can customize to do whatever function you want them to do. You also have a switch here which dials between your different focus capabilities on the fly to manual, autofocus, continuous, and so on. You can also do autofocus lock, which I like when I'm getting into the time lapse, which I'll explain here shortly. This is a mode dial here. You rotate this dial to switch between settings for your aperture and your shutter speed, so on and so forth. You also have your standard DSLR rotary knob here, which is a pretty positive locking system so it doesn't get accidentally turned. You can switch to direct camera mode, so you can do manual settings while you're in your camera mode. You've got custom, you've got panoramic, so you can do panoramic work. You've got different scene scenarios, custom photography shots. You have the eye auto mode, which is basically the camera doing all the manual work for you through algorithms, giving you the best picture. You've got program mode, you've got aperture, shutter, manual mode, and then back to the video mode. So you have a lot of customizing, just like you would have with a really good quality DSLR. You can see the record button is placed right here next to the trigger for the photography button. You could use either one of these buttons to activate recording. Obviously the one here is when you're on photography mode. This knob here is what gives you your different zoom ranges, so you can zoom in. Another cool feature that I want to mention in this video is that this camera is Wi-Fi compatible, so you can directly upload pictures when you're connected on your Wi-Fi network to various websites like Instagram, I believe, so on and so forth. It also has the compatibility to sync to your smartphone. I use the iPhone. There's an app you can download which gives you the capability of remotely operating this camera, which could be beneficial if you're doing long exposure shots. You can activate the shutter without actually touching the camera. And if you do photography, you know what I'm referring to when it comes to long exposure shots, so you can do that as well. The Wi-Fi works pretty well. You can do it either for an Android platform or an iOS iPhone platform, and I find that it works really well. You've got a lot of detail you can do in there, and it's really good, just like I said, for remotely operating the camera, so you don't have to touch the camera and reduce vibrations and shakes, or whatever you want to do from there. You choose from that point. Now I am going to touch on one thing really briefly, is that this camera is got a pretty fast aperture, which is f2.8. The benefit of an f2.8 is that you get really shallow depth of field, and the f2.8, unlike most telephoto lenses, is continuous through the entire zoom range. So if you have your aperture set to 2.8 for maximum light gathering capabilities and for really, shallow depth of field, and you're zooming in, it doesn't change, so you don't have to fiddle with your exposures. Unlike other telephoto lenses that have aperture variables when you start to zoom in, which affects your exposure, then you got to go mess with it. This one has a fixed aperture of 2.8 all the way through the zoom range. I have never seen that before in a bridge camera. The one I had prior to this did not have that capability. If you've done any kind of photography work, if you understand what I'm talking about, that is a super cool feature. Also on the side here, I want to point out that you do have a mic input, so you can run an external shotgun mic if you wanted to, or a microphone lavalier, depending on how you set yourself up. You can do that through the mic input there. Rotating the camera around, I want to point out on the side here, that to focus, is that here on the side is where you have your HDMI input. You can do a remote trigger if you want to do a wired remote, as well as a AV audio out. And I want to briefly mention, without going into too much detail, that this camera is 100% weather sealed. What that means for you is that moisture and water do not get in this. So if you're out, and this is why I say this is a perfect camera for hikers and backpacks, because if you're out hiking and backpacking and you do filmmaking while you do your hikes and backpacking, documentary, whatever you do, you are going to get caught out in the rain. And if you have a really nice camera and you get caught out in the rain, you're going to be scrambling to cover it up or put it away, or basically not be able to shoot anymore because you don't want to get your camera wet. Well, this camera is pretty much 100% waterproof. Now, it is not submergible in water. It is not a GoPro. You do not dunk this in water. but it is weather sealed enough to where if it gets a downpour or rain on it, or if you spill a cup of water on it, it's not going to damage. All of the buttons, all of the openings, the battery case, the HDMI inputs, the mic input, all of that are all weather sealed with rubber grommets, so moisture does not get in. And like I say, that is why I think this camera makes the perfect backpacking and hiking camera, solely for the fact that it is completely weather sealed from dust and moisture. So that's really, really, really good. Giving you a little bit of a 360 here. Now the grip on this camera is very large. So if you've ever had a DSLR, this is a very large grip, so you get a really good, positive, comfortable feel on it. So it's really comfortable in the hands. Another feature that I really want to elaborate on in this camera is time lapse. We've all seen those videos where someone is taking a time lapse of clouds rolling in, of a storm, of a flower blooming, whatever it might be. Time lapse is extremely fun to use. It adds a really good feature to your videos. It really adds some texture, whatnot, and some really cool idea you can actually incorporate into your video. I use a lot of time lapse. I used to use it on my phone, so I would always have to pull out my phone, set it up to do a time lapse. Well, this camera has a built-in time lapse mode already internal. I'm going to go through just some of the basic steps of how easy it is to get into time lapse. So simply, I just want to hit the menu button. And I've already got it set there, but there's your time lapse. You want to select time lapse, and you basically want to go down to shooting interval. I'm going to click on that, and you can do pretty much any custom interval that you want to do. So you can adjust by, take a shot every 1 minute, adjust that to 0, take a shot every. Now for rolling clouds, if the cloud movement is pretty quick, I prefer to do 3-second intervals. That's just my preference for the filming of clouds. And then you can also go down and you can start selecting how many images you want to take. I found to get 9 seconds worth of video footage with 3-second intervals with clouds, I pretty much calculated about 270 shots. Now you can increase this to 300, 400, 500, however many you want to do. And it also gives you the exact time as how long it's going to take to do it and when it will stop. And then you click your set button, and then you hit start now, and then you want to, you can also time this and set it up if you want to do it at a certain time, but I basically just hit now, hit start, and then you press the shutter button once you've got the correct exposure for your shots. You can see there it goes, and that's time lapse. And once it's done, it'll basically ask you, do you want to convert to video? You say yes. Then it's going to ask you the frame rate, and you say I would say 30 frames per second roughly, and then it renders it into a video, and then you can extract it and do what you want with it. So that's basically how time lapse works. Now I also want to explain that the ISO settings on this camera are only from 100 to 3200. So your ISO range is not as great as other cameras, but it's still pretty effective. I find that if you can keep the ISO down to 100, especially if you're out during the daytime, it's not a big issue. But when you're in those low light situations and you're filming in a low light, and you have to crank up the ISO, there is going to be some noise that's pretty much inherent with these small sensors when you start to crank the ISO. There's nothing you can do about it, so that is going to be a trade-off for you. I mostly shoot during the day when I'm out hiking or whatnot, so that's really not a big issue for me. But I just want to keep you open, to the idea that this camera only has an ISO range of 100 to 3200, and it's pretty noisy when you start to get above 800 in low light situations. Now I just want to give you an idea that when I used to film before I got this camera, I had a really crummy Canon bridge camera which didn't do really good on resolution and photography work. It was very cumbersome to operate, didn't have a touchscreen or a mic input. But I only paid $100 for that camera, and it did well for a good while. But when I finally upgraded, this has been a really good bonus for me. The other camera that I use, which I'm filming on right now, is my Sony DSLR. It's the A33, which is a mirrorless camera. If I took this camera out in the field, I would have to switch between 4 lenses, so that's a lot of weight and gear to carry. I would have to carry my telephoto lens, which is a 70-300 millimeter. I mean, this thing is like a big beer can. This is all metal. This is extremely heavy. For my portrait work, I would use my 50 millimeter super fast aperture 1.4. So this is really good for those really shallow depths of field. Really good for portrait work. But it's a fixed 50 millimeter. This is a prime lens. This is actually a vintage lens. And it's got manual focus capabilities. But this is really good for those really low light situations and you want to get really shallow depth of field. So I used to have to carry this one around. And then for street photography or just everyday use, I would use my prime 28 millimeter Minolta lens. This is a beautiful lens. I love it. Cost me like 50 bucks. It's autofocus capabilities, so it's all electronic and it fits right to my camera. But I would have to carry around, oh, not to mention the kit lens that's on the camera right now, which is a zoom lens, 18 to 55 millimeter. So it's a zoom lens, and it only goes to 3.5 in the aperture, so it doesn't do very well in low light or those shallow depths of fields. But this has always been my prime lens that I would go to. So I basically no longer have to carry these lenses around because this camera has a f2.8, which gives me that low light, shallow field of depth, but it also goes as high as f8, so I can get some good landscapes, get that really deep field of depth. And because it's a 25 millimeter to 600 millimeter, I've got the entire zoom range, so I can get those really long shots of animals that are far away or whatever I might need to be shooting at far distances. So that's pretty much going to wrap this video up. There's a lot of videos already on this camera. I'll include some footage that I've taken with this camera, some photos and whatnot, just to give you an idea of what this camera can do. And if you're in the market for a new camera and you're a hiker, backpacker, and you want an outdoor camera that's got all of the bells and whistles, robust features, touchscreen, the viewfinder here, which is extremely good for sunny conditions where you can't really see the screen very well, and you want all those features that you get from a really high-end DSLR, then this is a great consumer camera. This is not really for semi-pro or for professional use by any means, but with the Wi-Fi capabilities, connecting it to your smartphone, the weatherproof ceiling, the extreme zoom range of 25 to 600 millimeters, the Leica glass. I mean, this camera is incredible. I took it out for the first time yesterday or the day before, filmed at Old McDonald's farm, and I was just blown away. So if this video helps you in deciding on a new camera and you're in the market for one and you're, like I said, you're a hiker or a backpacker, consider the Panasonic Lumix FZ300. Alright folks, till we meet again.